I am Anna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. Speaking of self-discovery, today's episode is going to be illuminating. We are talking about childhood emotional neglect, C.E.N. Childhood emotional neglect is both simple in its definition and powerful in its effects. It happens when your parents fail to respond enough to your emotional needs while they're raising you. The key word here being enough. Emotional neglect is not emotional abuse or mistreatment. In some ways, it's the opposite. Emotional neglect is an invisible, subtle, and unmemorable childhood experience. Yet, unbeknownst to you, it can hang over you like a cloud, coloring your entire adult life. If you'd like to know whether or not you have C.E.N., there is a free questionnaire on my guest's website. I am speaking with Jonice Webb, Ph.D., a licensed psychologist, speaker, blogger, and best-selling author of 2 books. Her first book is called Running on Empty: Overcome Your Childhood Emotional Neglect. And her second book is even better, in my opinion. It's called Running on Empty, No More: Transform Your Relationships with Your Partner, with Your Parents, and Your Children. Dr. Jonice Webb is recognized worldwide as the pioneer of childhood emotional neglect. She created the first and only childhood emotional neglect recovery program. In the second part of our interview, we do talk about the recovery process and how change can happen. Jonice also provides professional training for licensed therapists in identifying and treating C.E.N. in their clients. As you may have already know, the topic of emotions is of deep interest to me personally, and I have done an entire series here on the podcast back in 2018 on emotions, and I have interviewed some of the world's renowned experts. If you haven't listened to any of the episodes in the series, I highly recommend. Or if you have listened, it's useful to revisit them again. They begin from episode 148 and they go through 158. Of course, I will have links in the show notes for your convenience. I may also recommend 2 other episodes. 125, How to Stay Calm in the Moment, and 129, How to Listen to Children's Big Feelings. Before we get to the interview, I am so excited to share some great news with you. We have a date for the Authentic Parenting Conference 2020. Yes, I have committed to a date, and it's October 17 in New Brunswick in the same venue. Save the date and keep your eyes open for more info. And now, please enjoy this fascinating interview with Dr. Jonice Webb. Well, Jonice, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Anna.
I'm excited to dive into this topic. I love your book and your work. So tell us, what is emotional neglect, childhood emotional neglect?
Well, it's a remarkably simple definition. Emotional neglect happens when your parents fail to respond enough to your emotions as they're raising you. You know, it sounds simple, but it's really not, because it's a very tricky thing to separate out emotions from behavior. And many parents are really pretty good at responding to behavior issues, or at least they definitely try their hardest. But the missing ingredient there can be addressing the emotions that are driving the behavior. When parents are not aware and able to do that well enough for their child, it does lead to some very identifiable pattern of problems in adulthood. And that was what my first book was all about, Running on Empty.
Yes, and it just explains so well that term, running on empty.
Yeah, it really is one of the major challenges of adulthood, having grown up with your feelings kind of under the radar, is a feeling of emptiness and lack of fulfillment, which is why I gave the book that name.
Yes. And as normal, healthy adults or human beings, we come to experience the world through emotions, right? I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the value of emotions and why it's so important to even talk about emotions, right? Why emotions are so important, why it matters.
Yes, I've been trying to call attention to this since 2012 when Running on Empty first came out, how important emotions are and how belittled they are in the world today. And I really do feel like this is changing, which makes me very happy. But emotions really are literally wired into us from birth, and they're not there for no reason. They are wired into us as a means to give us feedback about our world. And our emotions tell us what we want, what we need, how things affect us, what works for us and what doesn't. They'll direct us to make decisions. They help us in our relationships. They connect us to other people. They're the great source for fulfillment and richness in life. And so when the media, for example, or basically you can find all sorts of places in today's world where emotions are really treated as if they're a sign of weakness. And that has really pervaded our society and also is very true in other cultures as well. And it really causes lots of problems when parents who are raising kids are not really aware of the power and importance of not only their children's emotions, but their own.
Yes, I always give this example of when I was a little girl. I think maybe I was in second or third grade, not that little, actually, come to think of it. So I came home one day and my mom was having coffee. This is 70s, I think, or early 80s. My mom was having coffee in our kitchen, blue retro kitchen with our neighbor. And I came in, Mom, I want to go to the movies with the neighborhood kids. And my mom said no. And she didn't hit me, punish me, yell at me. I think as a child, and I was a very impulsive, I remember now, I was a very impulsive. Now I know that I'm an empath, a highly sensitive person. But I think at that time they never looked at it or didn't know. I was just always oversensitive and all of that. So I guess I had issues with my emotion regulation. So we had 3 bookcases on the wall, sort of like in a row on top of one another. I lay underneath those bookcases and I started kicking from the bottom, and they were filled with heavy books and china and things like that. Mm-hmm. And I remember my mom was still enjoying her coffee in the kitchen while I was going crazy and kicking and screaming because I heard no. And all of a sudden the bookcases fall. And somehow I scooch myself. I get out of there and everything breaks. And of course it was a disaster. And that memory is still with me as I'm parenting my daughter. And my parents were teachers. I'm like, wow, that is my emotional background. That's my emotional literacy. That's where I came from. And so the long thing is, as children, of course, we grew up in households where our parents did not speak the language of emotions. And we have to learn now sort of the ABCs of emotions in order to teach our children. We have to do this extra work.
Absolutely. I think that's a great story to illustrate the way you told the story. It was you asked, you got your answer, and then you were on your own. And you went and did your own thing, and your parents never re-entered the story. I'm sure they did. I'm sure they were very upset when you broke their china.
Yes.
And then you were a bad child.
Yes. My mom said, wait till your dad comes home. I remember that.
Classic line. Well, yeah, I mean, if your mother, so imagine the difference if she had said, okay, Anna, you really can't go. I know you really want to go, but here's the reason. I know it's very disappointing, and you can come back and talk to me about this later, but right now I want you to do your homework. Do you want some milk? You would still be really upset and disappointed. But then if you went off and you were moping, then your mom could come in and say, I know you're disappointed, Anna. I understand. I would be disappointed too if I were you. I would let you go if I could. And then just restate the reason. And it's really important that people understand that paying attention to your child's emotions and responding to them does not mean giving into them. And it doesn't mean over-explaining either. Parents don't have time or the need to go into long explanations with kids, which is one way you can go overboard the other direction. And I'm certainly not encouraging that. But just that piece of empathy of saying, I know you're disappointed. I would feel the same way. Here's why I have to say no, makes all the difference in the world.
Yes. And then you feel as a child seen, heard, validated. You still get the limit. The no is still the no, but at least somebody saw you and you felt like they understood you.
Exactly. So it doesn't compound the disappointment and the anger that comes with no, with a feeling of being by yourself with it, like you were under the shelf, and having no power at all and not being understood.
And of course, the way the parent responds to the child, and we can play this in different scenarios. Of course, what do we do typically? We can ignore, trivialize, minimize, dismiss, ignore, punish the child for having feelings in the moment or being dissatisfied.
Yes. And, I want to be really careful here to point out that almost all parents, if not all parents, have done some of that with their children at different times, because parents aren't perfect and they're not supposed to be perfect. And they don't need to be perfect or even fantastic. They just need to do a good, I use the word enough, and I put it in italics a lot when I'm writing, because it really, parents really just need to do enough. And that's it, to meet the child's threshold for emotional validation and attention. So it really doesn't take a lot. Just a little dose of empathy and validation on an everyday basis is plenty to sustain a child.
So when does it become then emotional neglect, childhood emotional neglect? Because I have done, I have threatened, I have ignored, I have dismissed many times. That's my, primary, I guess, pattern, dismissing my child's feelings. Even if I notice that in my adult relationships, what my patterns are, and I know where I learned those patterns. Mm-hmm. But when does it become sort of, I don't even want to use the word pathology. Do you use the word pathology? When does it become a pathology?
I think, the best way to know is when you're going too far with dismissing your child's feelings. Your child will tell you, because their feelings will either go away or they will get much stronger. And I've noticed girls' feelings tend to get stronger a lot. Boys tend to just push it down, and then you'll only see anger out of them. That's just a trend, but it's by no means across the board. But really the best way to tell is by your relationship with your child. If you start to feel like you're kind of losing contact with your child, or your child's behavior is getting worse, even though you're setting limits. I see parents who have those problems. I'm cracking down on my kid and they're acting worse. And then if I help them put a dose of empathy and understanding in there, just a few easy statements and a different sort of manner, and it really turns things around. It's a very powerful way to improve your relationship with your child. And it's just important to watch for it to change.
Yes. Okay. So what are the signs and symptoms of childhood emotional neglect in an adult? How can one know if they experience this? And you speak about in your book that you don't have to necessarily have gone through a very traumatic childhood to have childhood emotional neglect.
Oh, not at all. Not. In fact, it's so much the opposite that it's very misleading. That a lot of people say, well, I had a happy childhood, or I had nice parents. And that really is completely unrelated to childhood emotional neglect, which is partly what makes it so hard to know whether you grew up this way. And it's also why when I designed the emotional neglect questionnaire, which is on my website, people can take it for free. The questions are all about how you feel as an adult, because most people cannot recall emotional neglect from their childhood. Emotional neglect is really something your parents don't do. They don't say something and they don't do something that you need. And that's not something our brains record. So we don't remember that. But to answer your question, as adults, people who grew up this way tend to have a sort of a deep feeling of being separate from other people, kind of alone and different, a little bit of emptiness or numbness and lack of fulfillment, and also struggle with understanding the world of emotion and can find themselves kind of lost and at sea in relationships. Most people with CEN, childhood emotional neglect, I call it CEN for short, really are really upstanding people who want to do their best and are caring parents and really want to give their children what their children need. But they just have this blind spot to emotion, and it affects them in all of these ways that can just stay with them through their lifetimes.
Yes. A lot of people are uncomfortable with unhappy, negative emotions, right? And there are many ways that people cope or deal with that. And of course, it comes from their childhood. It sort of goes on from generation to generation, the patterns.
Yes, and it's not only negative emotions either. For a lot of people, it's any emotion.
Oh, really?
Yes, like so many people are raised with, how many times have your parents said, pipe down, don't get too excited, or let's not get carried away. Don't expect things to work out because, you never know. Those kinds of ways that parents can, tamp down children's spirits. And the reason they're doing it is really because they're uncomfortable with emotions in general, positive or negative.
Exactly, right? It makes sense because when you, as a child, let's say you're in discomfort and your parents didn't provide emotional support or safety, didn't listen and validate you in this way that we are talking about, then you learn to shut down your feelings, not be open to the world. And when you shut down or turn down those negative emotions, you also shut down the positive ones, right? You can't tell your heart, don't experience anger, sadness, or frustration, but experience joy. I feel like when we turn down the negative ones, we also close our heart.
It's so true. It's sort of like it's some people are able to do this somehow. Probably depends how your brain is built, but for most people, for most children, when they are required to kind of push away and hide certain feelings, they lose touch with them all. And that really is the mechanism that connects the childhood emotional neglect experience with the adult emptiness. It's that as a child, you had no choice but to hide your feelings from your parents and your family. And the only way to do that, since they're literally wired into you and the most deeply personal biological expression of who you are, the only way you can hide them is to wall them off. And then as an adult, the problem is you really need them for all those reasons that I described earlier about what our emotions do for us. So when you have CEN, you're literally walking through the world without a very valuable, vital, natural feedback system that would be guiding you and connecting you. And it does really affect people.
And this is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, this can lead you to commit crazy acts and risky activities, addiction, self-harming behaviors to feel something, right? I see that people who do have difficulties with their inner world, or they lost touch with their inner world, with their emotions, they often do crazy things. They get into crazy troubles because they don't trust themselves. They don't have the intuition, the judgment, and they do risky activities. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, actually, in my second book, Running on Empty No More, I talked about someone who was like that, who really was just a risk taker. And there are lots of different ways that people with CEN try to fill themselves. That emptiness just kind of sits there, and it pulls for, you just want to feel something because you've got the wiring for it, but you can't quite reach your actual feelings. So it's very natural to try to make yourself feel something. And, I really have seen that it can drive people to abuse substances. I've had quite a few patients who skydive or bungee jump or try to just do something that has to be extreme. One of my clients even told me that she would prefer she'll cause herself problems just so that she can feel something. Because she, even negative feeling is better than nothing.
Yes. And I work with a criminal addicted clientele as well. And what I see oftentimes, especially, I'm not sure if this is related, I'm just thinking out loud at the moment, the low socioeconomic population, they tend to have more children, right? And people are like, then why are they reproducing? Why are they having so many kids? I sometimes have this feeling that they want to feel something because this going through this childbirth, getting pregnant, having a child is a major thing. And maybe that's another way of filling themselves temporarily, at least, even though they end up having multiple children and they're not capable of caring for any of them sometimes. But is this something could be related to emptiness as well?
Well, that's an interesting question. Of course, there are various different factors that contribute to people of lower socioeconomic, the lower SES, having more kids. But I think it's probably more specifically a desire to feel a connection. And, it just seems like when you think about being a parent, it seems like, oh, my child will love me so much. And, that's not how parenthood is. It's really a one-way street going from the parent to the child. And when you get some back, it's great, right? But I think that there's a fantasy of, my child, I'm going to get all this love. And the first one doesn't do it. And then the second one doesn't do it. And you just keep trying.
Mm. So in your book, you identify 12 types of parents. And I would love to talk about about the 4 of them. If that's okay, let's use an example, however, either your example in the book, Zeke's example, or if you want to use my example, the one I described in the beginning, I'm okay with that as well.
Okay.
Can we do the narcissistic parent?
Oh, sure. So you're asking, how would the parent respond that would show that they were narcissistic?
Yes. If you want to use your own example from the book, Zig's example, I'm okay with that too, because my example maybe is not as fitting. But if you find it's appropriate, please use it too. I give you permission to use my example.
Okay. I'll use your example because everyone's already heard it. And it's also a really good one. So a narcissistic parent would view your actions as a challenge to, well, a narcissistic parent would probably not be all that concerned about your reaction because he or she would be very caught up in their own needs. So if you think about a narcissistic parent, this is a concrete example of figuratively what narcissistic parents are doing is looking in the mirror all the time. So the parent would be obsessed with themselves while you were very, very upset and hurting in the other room. And then when that narcissistic parent's china was broken, it would be damaging to their very core. They would feel damaged themselves by your action and would respond to it in that way. So narcissistic parents can be very harsh. They take the child's behavior as a personal assault on them. They're unable to see the child as a separate being from themselves. So they would react to the child as if their own right arm misbehaved and would see everything through the lens of their own needs. So that's the narcissistic parent.
And every bad behavior sort of, or good behavior reflects back on them. It's their achievement. It's their children are sometimes, I feel like they're accessories they present to the world, and it's either good for them or bad for them. And when the child is behaving poorly, it's about them, not about the child.
Exactly. It's, look what you're doing to me.
Yes. Look, my reputation. Now I'm embarrassed in front of, how am I going to go out there if you act like this? It's like causes so much shame and guilt in a child, right?
Yes, definitely. It's very harmful to the child.
Yes. Okay. Next, how about the authoritarian parent?
Yeah, they're interesting because I think there are so far fewer authoritarian parents now than there were
before. Yes,
because the silent generation, which raised the baby boomers, were far more authoritarian, and that was even a step forward from how parenting had been before that. But the authoritarian parent can, has some in common with narcissistic, but it's for different reasons. So authoritarian parents view obedience as love and disobedience as a lack of love. And it really just comes from a very kind of simplistic cookie cutter view of what parents are and what children are. So children are meant to obey. And if they don't obey, they are showing disrespect and a lack of love. And really, a lot of authoritarian parents will refer to that as disrespect. Respect is a big word in authoritarian households. So that they'll apply the same parenting approach to each kid, cookie cutter parenting. Here's how I am, here's how you're supposed to be, without really any awareness of who each individual child is, what each individual child might need. And there's really not a give and take. It's a one-way street. But it really is not because the parent is obsessed with themselves. It's because, as a narcissist, it's because they really just don't know the complexity of parenting. They were probably raised this way themselves, and it's the best they can do. It's their view of what their job is. But it does leave the child with a feeling of being an Oreo cookie, like, well, here I am. I'm supposed to just be this. I'm supposed to be in this form. So kids of authoritarian parents often can be either very shut down or quite rebellious.
Yes, either extreme. That's true.
Yeah.
Well, on the other end of that continuum, opposite of the authoritarian, we have the permissive parents.
Yeah.
How would have the permissive parent responded to the situation?
The permissive parent would probably say, yes, you can go to the movies, and the whole thing would be avoided.
Oh, okay.
That's what permissive parents do. They don't like to say no. They don't want to make their child unhappy. They don't want friction. And they feel like that is what love is, and that's what their job as parenting is. And, that's a way of being out of tune with your child, because children need limits. They need to know that there's a ceiling in terms of how badly they can behave. So let's say that the parent did say no for whatever reason. You couldn't go to the movies. You did your thing with the shelf. The permissive parent would, kind of act like your buddy and say, oh, well, guess you weren't happy about the movies, and try to make a joke out of it maybe, and say, I was trying to get rid of that china anyway. I'll take you to the movies. Right. So that teaches the child that there's no limits on her behavior. You would have learned that all you have to do is make a scene or make a big mess, and you could get your way. I think permissive parenting is a lot more common now than authoritarian parenting.
Yes, I agree with that completely. Yes, because I think we learned that, authoritarian parenting wasn't good, and we sort of awoke as a generation. We're conscious parents, and there's so much information out there, and everybody's trying to evolve and change. Somehow we gravitate towards the permissive parenting because we don't want to be harsh as our parents. We don't want to exercise control, but then we fail to set limits, have expectations, create structure. We sort of lose our role as a parent, as a leader, which
Yes.
of course I endorse on this podcast, a more democratic type of parenting. That yes, you have to listen to your child's feelings, but you have to set the limit as well on their behavior, or teach them right and wrong. I once was speaking maybe 5-6 years ago to a group of parents, and one of the ladies raised her hand, and she had a baby, perhaps like below 7 months old. The baby cannot speak. That's what I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
And she raised her hand and said, I have a question for you. How can I raise my child without ever saying N-O? And she's spelling as if the baby understands the word no. And she's so careful not to even use the word no. I looked at her and I was taken aback at first. What do you say to this woman? My first instinct is, no, you can't, woman. That's completely bad.
Yes.
You're doing a disservice to your child,
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of permissive parenting, touching, that edge of that continuum.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that woman was there. She wanted to learn about parenting. She was a good parent and a loving parent. She just didn't know what to do. And so she's in danger of being permissive with her child. Then her child is not going to learn the limits of emotion and how to understand emotions, how to manage her own emotions, how to understand emotions in other people. There's a whole training ground for emotions in parenting that this woman is going to miss giving her child. And so that's sad.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then you have this parent, the last parent in your book, the number 12 type, is the well-meaning but neglected themselves parent.
Yes.
Please speak about this type.
So the well-meaning but neglected parent, I call them WMBNT for short. There are so many of these parents in today's world. They're good people. They love their children. They want to be good parents. And they really try to be good parents. And they may even be providing their child with everything that they need materially. A good school, a good home, plenty of food, clothes, all of that. So the child is fully provided for in every way. But the parents themselves were raised by parents who did not know about feelings or pay attention to their feelings while they were being raised. So these parents grew up with a blind spot to the world of emotion. Their feelings are pushed down, and they have C.E.N themselves. And so they are raising their children also with a blind spot to emotion, with all of the best intentions, but just lacking the tools to give their children this vital ingredient to life, which is emotional awareness and emotional intelligence. So this parent in that scenario would be very similar perhaps to how you described it happening in your house. I'm not sure what exactly happened after you kicked the shelf. Actually, I don't know at all, but
I can tell you.
if after you kicked the shelf, your parents, sent you to your room and thought to themselves, wow, Anna has serious behavior issues. I need to really crack down on her. I'm going to, ground her tomorrow. I mean, you were 7, so maybe it's like no TV, no this or that for Anna, and just sort of like delivering that news to you without talking to you about it at all. So the interesting thing is, none of that's necessarily the wrong thing for the parent to do. You probably needed to have a consequence for what you did. However, again, an emotionally attuned parent would go, say, Anna, please go into your room while I, think for a minute, and then would go in and say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to clean up this mess, and I want you to do a really good job, and I'm going to be there to watch and help you. And then after that, we're going to talk about what the consequence is going to be for this. And we're going to talk about what we're going to do in the future when we feel disappointed or upset about something. So using it as an opportunity for education and connection is what an attuned parent would do in contrast.
Yes. But why are we so afraid of emotions? Right? Why are we so not comfortable?
I think it really, first of all, emotions can be very powerful. There's probably not a human alive who hasn't felt overwhelmed by a feeling or driven by a feeling or just like, what's the word? Just overwhelmed by a feeling at some point. And so feelings can be very powerful and feel like they're outside of our control. So that's the first thing. And then the second reason I think really is because of C.E.N. Because I think if you're raised in a household that's comfortable with emotions, that talks about emotions, that uses emotion words and addresses feelings in your childhood home, you grow up with a certain comfort level with your own feelings and the feelings of other people. And that's because you have mastery over them. You understand how they work. You know how to manage yours. And these are all the skills of emotional intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But so many people don't have that. And so they're just sort of left feeling at sea when emotions enter the room. And all they know how to do is shut down.
Yes, numb, avoid, distract themselves.
Mm-hmm.
We do everything but allow ourselves to feel the feeling, which comes and goes. And when you sit with the discomfort, which I have learned ever since, good news, I became a lot better managing my feelings, sitting with the discomfort of a rising anxiety that you feel like, oh my gosh, what's happening to me? But then you notice you breathe through your feeling and it's okay. It's dissolving. It's not gripping you forever. It actually changes and shifts in your body. Once you learn to allow yourself to feel, right, and be with it, you become a lot more comfortable with the discomfort.
Yes. And what you're describing there are some of the most vital emotion skills that we all need to have. And just kind of the understanding, as you were describing that you understand how emotions work, and that if you, instead of running from them, sit with them, try to put words to what you're feeling and try to understand why you're feeling it. I love the way you describe it as something shifts and it just feels different. And then that's you listening to your feedback system. That's you listening to your inner self and validating your feelings and yourself. And it gives you this valuable information about what you need to do next. And that helps you feel like you have mastery over your life. And that's essential to being a good parent.
Wow, that's really great. So can parents overdo the emotion coaching? In other words, can they overuse emotion words? Can they maximize the situation when it's not that big of a deal because they want to raise emotionally healthy children? Can this go to an extreme? And how so?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it can go to an extreme. For example, if your parent, after you knocked the shelf, just sat down and talked with you about your feelings, didn't give you any consequence, didn't give you any suggestions for what to do in the future, didn't learn something about who you are from that incident, or teach you anything about yourself, but just talked about the feelings part, that would not be very helpful to you. It might help you in some ways, but there would be another big piece missing. So I think over focusing on feelings to the exception of, limits and behavior would be bad. It's hard to picture a parent doing that. So I don't think that it's a rampant in society or anything like that.
I don't think it's rampant, but the reason I say that, I have noticed a parent do that.
Mm-hmm.
Not that many parents, but a specific example came to mind when I say that. And I feel like then a child becomes more self-centered, self-absorbed. Everything becomes about them and they magnify everything, even the smallest things, right? Isn't it all about perspective? I feel like sometimes I think that our response, our emotional support, our emotional coaching has to be in proportion to the event, to the emotion or the feeling the child is feeling, right? If your child is crying on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 is the level that your child lost control and crying, you can't say, "Oh, I understand. You're sad. You're so sad right now. Yeah, that's sad." Like,
Right.
very flat response. Or if your child is 1 on a scale of 1 to 5, they're upset, but very mildly upset. You go, "Oh my gosh," and you dramatize and respond, "What are you feeling now, sweetheart? Oh, let's empathize." And you make a big deal out of it. That's what I'm talking about. Then the child becomes hyper-focused on themselves, self-centered, self-absorbed. I think there could be a danger in that.
Oh, definitely. I would call that a permissive parent who's indulging the child's emotions and giving them too much power.
Oh, I see. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because the whole idea behind emotion is teaching the child how to manage it. And to do that, you have to give them the limits. You have to give them the language, give them the understanding and the awareness. And those are all tools that you can't get by saying, "Oh, you poor baby, you're sad."
So let's summarize this part before we move on to how we can recover and talk about self-care a little bit, tracking our feelings. I would love to talk about a few of those things. Let's summarize by giving the points of what would a healthy or effective emotion coaching look like.
From a parent?
Mm-hmm. From a parent who is attuned and loving and is setting limits.
So it involves naming your child's emotions. And if the child's old enough, ask, "Am I right? Is that what you're feeling? I understand why you're feeling that way." Maybe if it's true, saying, "I would feel that way too if I were in your shoes. I get it." And also striving to feel what your child is feeling, which is true empathy. And empathy is the magical bonder of parents and children. Then looking at the behavior and the connection between the child's feelings and any problem behavior that's happened, setting a limit on that behavior and explaining what to do with these feelings in the future. So in order to be able to do all those things, obviously the parent has to have those skills themselves.
Yes. And if you I think when the parent gets triggered, of course, you cannot do all of those steps. Then it's a good idea to remove yourself, calm yourself down. That's what we talk about the podcast a lot. And then come back and set the limit and talk about the next steps and choosing the right action and maybe listening to your child's feelings then if you can't do it in the moment.
Definitely. Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
So the third part of your first book is the filling the tank. How change happens. What are some first steps someone can take to change the patterns of CEN?
So the process of healing, I've developed a system which consists of a number of different steps. And the first one is one thing people can do that can make a big difference is start paying attention to your own feelings. If you were raised this way, you're probably focused outward most of the time, as opposed to focusing inward and trying to identify where your feelings are in your body, where you feel them, and when you're feeling one. And just simply the act of turning your attention inward and focusing on your body and asking yourself what you're feeling. And I do have like a 5-step process described in my book that guides people through that process. And then trying to put words to what you're feeling, asking yourself, why am I feeling this right now? What is this feeling telling me? What's the message that my body is sending me with this feeling? And do I need to take an action? Is my body telling me that I need to do something? So learning that process and becoming better at it is a big part of healing. And then learning the emotion skills, what to do with emotions when you're having them, starting to, as you go through this process, it starts to affect how you feel in the world and how you express yourself. And then you can you're set up to learn some new skills about how you interact with other people too.
What do you see in your clients when they first learn the healing process and they go and practice new skills in the world? What kind of quote unquote mistakes do they encounter, if any? What are some common things that happen when the person starts living in this open-hearted way?
It's funny. A lot of people are really worried that people will exaggerate and say, "Oh, I don't want to do this. I'm afraid I'll end up in the hospital," or, "I'll go crazy." And then that never, ever, ever, ever happens. And instead, what happens is that you start to just feel more grounded and more in your own skin. You start to feel more like you know yourself and able to make choices that are good for you as opposed to what you think everyone else thinks you should do. You become more self-directed, more self-confident. As you learn that you can trust your feelings, you realize that you have this feedback system to rely on, and it helps you feel less alone in the world and less kind of rudderless, and you feel more like you understand what you're doing and why. It allows you to be more present in your own life. I could go on and on and on and on with this. The changes are incredible. And, it doesn't happen all at once. It's a step-by-step process where you become more and more tuned in with yourself, and it just changes. Other people notice too. They notice that you seem different.
Where can the listener find you, Jonice, online?
I'm at emotionalneglect.com. And on my website, there are all kinds of free resources. And you can take the emotional neglect questionnaire for free. And then I'll send you my newsletter, which comes out once a week and sometimes even more often. And I also have an online CEN recovery program that walks people through the steps and provides support on an ongoing basis. They're both of my books. We didn't mention my second book, but it's about how to apply the principles of CEN to improve your marriage and your relationship with your parents and your parenting.
Yes, I know. That's like another podcast.
Yeah.
I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being present here, doing the work that you do. Truly admire your work. And from the bottom of my heart, a big thank you.
Thank you from the bottom of my heart back, Anna.
And that is it, my dear listener, for this episode of the Authentic Parenting Podcast. What do you think? Are you intrigued, curious, puzzled, alarmed? Did you take the questionnaire on Dr. Jonice Webb's website to find out whether or not you have C.A.L.M? I would love to hear your thoughts and takeaways from this interview. Let's continue the conversation in our private Facebook group. As I mentioned in my intro, we have a date for the Authentic Parenting Conference 2020, and I would love to see you there. We do not have tickets for sale yet, but you can learn about the past event, about our last year's event, on my website, authenticparenting.com/conference. The page is still up. And we have done 2 episodes about our takeaways. One episode 179, takeaways from the Authentic Parenting Conference 2019 with the MC of the conference. And the other episode is 180, Unplugged with Dr. Laura Froyen. If you attended the conference last year, of course, I would love to see you this year as well. So save the date and more info will be coming soon. Follow me on Instagram. My username is authentic.parenting.podcast. And for show notes, contact info, and everything else, as always, visit authenticparenting.com. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the show, rate and review it on Apple Podcasts. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna C.A.L.M. Thank you so much for listening.